Chapter 12, Vietnam War, Bringing the Battlefield into the American Living Room. The Vietnam War into the American living room? It was in our family. I was the prime age for being drafted or volunteering for military service during the Vietnam conflict, so the war was a frequent topic of discussion around our home. The Vietnam War. Not according to my father, a World War II veteran who was a waist or side of the plane gunner on a B-17 bomber through more than a dozen missions over Germany. He had volunteered to fight in the Second World War, but when Vietnam came along, he made a clear distinction between a declared war and what he and many others called a police action. Several times while sitting in our living room, watching some of those cowboy shows I referred to in an earlier chapter introduction, we discussed the draft. He told me, repeatedly, Vietnam was not a war, and that if I got drafted, he would pay my way to Canada if I chose to leave the country. Drafted. Back in the day, every 18-year-old male was legally obligated to spend 2 years in military service to the United States. Yes, we now have voluntary military service, but at several times in U.S. history, conscription, or legally mandated military service, has been used to assemble the necessary human resources for military service. The most recent draft was initiated about 1940 and was focused on raising troops for World War II. It was still in effect in the 1960s when I was about to become draft eligible at age 18. I and other 18-year-old males had to register with Selective Service and went into a draft. If we had no obvious physical or other reasons to not serve, we were likely registered as 1A, available for military service. Some who registered when called up were found to be unfit for military service, 4F. They might have had a medical or other condition that kept them from serving in the military, or they might apply for and achieve a conscientious objector status, 1AO, usually based on religious grounds. Some, however, chose not to register. These folks were generally called draft dodgers, and some of them went to Canada to avoid the draft. Hence my father's offer to pay my way to Canada. There were some deferments available, which meant, if qualified, draftees who applied for and received a deferment would give their service but would defer the time at which they would enter the military. One such deferment was an educational deferment, 2S. If a potential draftee was attending college, he could apply for the deferment and, if approved, finish his education before going into service. I registered at age 18 and was quickly assigned as 1A, but 2 months later had started college without being drafted. So if drafted, I would have the option of going into the service or applying for a deferment. And I had a father who said he would support me if I decided to go to Canada as a draft dodger. Quite a stand for a World War II veteran. I was conflicted as to what I should do. I knew my father's service record and deeply respected his and all other World War II veterans' military service. They risked their lives for all of us. Not only them, but all the veterans before them and all of the veterans since World War II, including those of the Korea and Vietnam eras, and I still respect what they did for the rest of us. So running off to Canada didn't seem right, but my father's expressed view about the conflict not being a war was also very persuasive, and my father had never steered me wrong in the first 18 years of my life. I thought a lot about the potential changes in my life, but nothing drove me to immediate or drastic action, namely packing up and heading for Canada. So I decided to wait on the draft to take my chances with the 1A classification and continue to go to college. What happened? The lottery system of selecting draftees happened. My birth date was considered in the second year of a new lottery system whereby the Selective Service drew, as if from a hat, days of the year in a random sequence, and then drafted the men whose birthdays corresponded with those days in the sequence in which the days were drawn. I can remember talking with family and friends, especially my buddies, about what our numbers would be. If drafted, and after seeing all of the television news reports, the battlefield brought into the American living room, as it was called, we pretty much felt that if drafted and sent to Vietnam, we would be unlikely to survive and would never get back to our country our homes, and our families alive. In the first draft lottery, for which I was not yet eligible, on December 1st, 1969, my birth date came up as number 335. Yeesh. No way I would get that kind of high number at the next lottery when I would be draft eligible. I started thinking about Canada and an educational deferment and whether I would apply for it if drafted. The next lottery was on July 1st, 1970. I had completed my first year of college, had a serious girlfriend, and was really wishing I had not used up the number 335 in the previous lottery. I knew my actual number this time, when it counted, couldn't possibly be as high, so I was really anxious to learn the results of the lottery. I could not believe it, but this time, in the lottery that counted, my birthday was selected 352, meaning 351 other birthday dates would be used in that draft before they used my birth date. I am sure I heaved a sigh of relief, checked in with my girlfriend, family, and friends, and started planning for fall semester classes. I had a few buddies who were not so fortunate and who had much lower numbers in the lottery, but as far as I can remember, they all applied for student deferments and received them. I remained 1A and never did apply for the student deferment, figuring if I did get drafted, it was fate, or it was as it ought to be according to God's plan for me. However that went, I gave up on me making a decision about the military and finished college. And within 2 years of my graduation, the U.S. withdrew all military forces from Vietnam. And that's one small personal angle that might make the conflict in the country over the Vietnam War or police action a bit more real for those of you who were not there. And this is a not so brief introduction to Chapter 12, Vietnam War Bringing the Battlefield into the American Living Room. Read the chapter and see how the media played a significant role in informing me, my family, my buddies, and the rest of the nation of the ebb and flow in military success in Vietnam and the eventual change in support for the police action there.